Hello everyone and welcome back to this episode of the Kerbal Space Agency. In this episode we'll be featuring the Vanguard 1 mission and the Discover 13 mission of NASA. So, let's first start by researching the necessary technologies for the Vanguard 1. While unfortunately there wasn't a specific mission for the Vanguard 1, I went with the normal science from space mission, because that's pretty much what the real thing did as well. Before recording this, I thought I would need maneuver notes for the Vanguard 1 mission as well, but instead they were only needed for the Discover 13, so I did upgrade the mission control building and the tracking station. And here is the Vanguard 1 rocket carrying the Vanguard 1 satellite, the satellite that was intended to be the first rocket to go into space, but was delayed because of problems with the Vanguard engine. And honestly, after this video I think I understand why. It took me many attempts myself, especially with the recently added mod of remote tech, as you might have noticed. So why did I add remote tech, you may ask? Well, for two reasons. First, because the next version of KSP will have sort of the same thing, but also because NASA has a lot of satellite launches, so it would be a waste of missions to not include remote tech in the end of the day. So as you will see now, the upper stage is almost as large as the lower stage, and this is the same as the original Vanguard mission. So as we ascend the Vanguard probe into its orbit, let's talk about the Vanguard mission itself. The Vanguard in its entirety, from the satellite, the rocket, the engine, were all developed by the US Navy. And while it was the second American satellite in orbit, it was the fourth in total after the Sputnik 1 and the Sputnik 2, and in fact it was the first solar-powered satellite as well as the oldest object that is still in orbit today as we speak. And having mentioned the solar panels, this is why I had to do some research before launching this mission into space. Obviously, to be able to do the research and the upgrades, I had to do some more missions, but all of them were in the atmosphere. Every mission that gets into space will be recorded in this series. So the original mission had periaps up 660 kilometers above the Earth, which is why I first raised the apoaps at 660. In fact, I overshot a little, so I had to throttle back to bring it back to 660 kilometers above the Earth. So now, I time accelerated until the Kerbal Space Center was in the horizon at the apoaps. There, it was time to start the first burn, which bring the apoaps to the proper apoaps of the mission, which was 3,840 kilometers above the Earth. So while this first burn is taking place, let's talk a bit about the historical details of this mission. This mission launched on March 17, 1958, which is the date that marks the object that's the longest in orbit, from Cape Canaveral in Florida. And as you can see now, the apoaps and the periaps finally switch around, but it's not long until the Kerbal Space Center disappears below the horizon, so I have to cancel until the second burn. So while we wait until the Space Center is at the horizon of the apoaps once more, let's talk about the science performed by the mission itself. The radio beacon of the Vanguard was able to detect the slight north-south asymmetry of the Earth. Additionally, because of its symmetry, it was able to detect the atmospheric drag of the atmosphere in these high altitudes. Its signal decayed on May 1964, however the satellite can be still optically tracked from the Earth. This and 3 other Vanguard satellites have been launched after this one. So now we perform some small orbital corrections and we collect the science from the mission and Kerbal Space program. However, because it was on the night side, the battery was not enough to transmit the entire science back to the ground, and we had to boot up the backup power system to separate the stages. So now, with all the science being transmitted and the probe being separated, it's time to go for a full run around the Earth so we can charge the batteries and then turn off the backup power system again. Now, with this mission being yet another complete success, it's time to go back to the Space Center to prepare for the next mission. So, because the next mission is the Discover 13 mission, we need to research the Thora Gina rocket because this is the rocket that brought the Discover 13 into orbit around the Earth. As you can see, this takes us a lot of branches further because this rocket is really massive compared to what we had right now. So now, with the necessary parts being purchased, it's time to go to accept the contract with Discover 13. If you don't already know, the Discover 13 was the first craft that successfully managed a re-entry from orbit. This time we will be going to the VAB to show you the Discover 13 atop the Thora Gina rocket. Really, it's the first time I do that because I felt this rocket is really massive compared to what we had in the past, so I thought it was really nice to show it on the VAB as well. Just imagine when we'll have the Saturn rocket that will bring us to the moon. That will be truly massive. I'm really looking forward to that. So now it's time for the launch. Unfortunately KSP had a little glitch, but that didn't create any problems for the launch. First, before talking about any historical details of this mission, I felt I had to say that I skipped quite a lot of missions, but that wasn't because I didn't want to do them, that was mainly because there was nothing for them to do on KSP context that would be pretty much the same you saw on the Explorer 1 on the last episode. Namely, there were many more Explorer missions doing some further research into the Van Allen radiation belt around the Earth. NASA was also turning from them to do lunar flybys, but unfortunately all these early Pioneer missions were failing. One mission I almost put into the series is the SCORE satellite. This satellite was the first to relay communication from space down to the Earth, and basically carried a message from President Dwight D. Eisenhower about world peace. This mission was obviously rather ironic because the message was intended to the Soviet Union, and the satellite was actually launched aboard an army rocket. The reason I chose not to put SCORE into the series was because SCORE was a low Earth orbit satellite, so it would look almost the same as Explorer 1. Regardless, as you might have noticed, the apoapse already at 258 kilometers, and at this time I had actually set up the maneuver to go at the apoapse of 683 kilometers, which was the actual Discover 13 orbit. What was special about the Discovery rocket was that they were in a polar orbit ever since the Discovery 1. Every Discovery rocket since Discovery 1 tried to retrieve itself from space, but only Discover 13 managed to do this first. Here, the flight computers attempt to do the maneuver by itself, but unfortunately, because of the bad gimbal range of the Agena engine, there's a problem and a deviation in the final orbital trajectory. Of course, this wouldn't have happened without the remote tech mod, but this is the layer of realism it is adding, and I really like that. The actual mission performed 17 orbits before returning to the ground, so to be able to do that without taking too much time, I went to the tracking station to be able to time accelerate until 17 orbits have been completed around Kerbin. So why was it so desired to be able to recover a Discovery mission? Well, the Discovery satellites were actually spy satellites, that's why they were disclosed at the time they were launched, and they were launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. So at the time, these satellites were carrying film of Soviet activity, so the Americans had to be able to recover this somehow. The Discovery satellites were also then known as the Corona satellites. So when did this happen, you may ask? This mission was launched on the 10th of August 1960, which is actually less than a year from the Mercury Redstone 7 of Alan Shepard. So here we are doing the first burn. The reason I decided to go with a 2-burn maneuver was because I wanted to land as close as possible to the Space Center. So after that, I went ahead and created a maneuver node, which was a few days ahead from then, which landed pretty close to the Kerbal Space Center. This of course because we needed the communication to be able to perform the landing. Any attempt I had to be able to automate the parachutes to open at a certain altitude always failed, and that was actually because of the pressure, because they opened always way too early, which always ripped them off. This was the plan, however, but as you will see, something quite different happened. As you can see here, that the orbit burn started and it will hold for a few seconds until we are at the landing spot of the Kerbal Space Center. This engine is much slower than the Agena engine that brought us into space, which is why this burn is taking a bit more time, but that's why it's also way more efficient. So while we're into this last 12 seconds of this deorbit burn, let me just take the chance to mention that I bought the drogue suits from the tech tree, but I forgot to mention this because I actually forgot to record that part. The reason drogue suits are needed is because this craft has a really high speed into low altitude, so that there's no way the main parachute can block all the speed all by itself. So I now turn off the backup battery so we can turn it on again when we have communication to the base. And since this moment is getting very close, you will then understand why I'm calling this episode the Vanguard episode. So while we're waiting for the Discoverer to break to the other side of Kerbin, let's talk about the other missions that were before the Discoverer. First, there were many more Vanguard missions. There was Tyros, the first ever weather satellite. There was Pioneer 5, the first ever satellite to investigate the interplanetary space between Earth and Venus. There was Solrad, a satellite that investigated the solar radiation coming to Earth. And there was even the first GPS satellite, Transit 2A. But Transit 2A was only in low Earth orbit and was used only by the Navy, just like the internet that was first used by the Army before getting to the public use. So at this point, I turned on the backup power system to be able to do another burn to slow down the craft, because without it would always overheat and explode. But I had a surprise which you will see pretty soon. I thought I was connected to the base, but apparently the satellite, as you can see, was connected to Vanguard, and the reason I went to the map was to see if landing so far from the base would be a communication problem and if I had to open the parachutes early so they will be open during the landing, but the surprise meant that I could open the parachutes on time without having to worry about the re-entry heating destroying them. The Vanguard was the sweetest surprise I had in this episode. I would like so much to be able to say that I had it accounted, but I really didn't. But once for sure, I will always have that in mind for the next episodes, to be able to look at the satellite positions to be helpful on my re-entry to the atmosphere. One thing I haven't yet mentioned about the Discoverers was the first ever spy satellites to be used in space, and in fact, later in the program they were carrying up to 9.8 kilometers in film. One other amazing fact about them is that they were recovered mid-air by a flying airplane in this area, so they were not recovered by civilians. Which means that if I were able to do the same on KSP, now that in a few seconds the parachute will open, there will have to be an airplane flying around to be able to recover it while it lands down, because landing on the ground will be a bad thing for this sensitive material. And as you can see, the drogue chutes have opened thanks to the connection to the Vanguard rocket, and now we're just waiting for the main chute to be able to deploy, which was just deployed, which means we're just on course to be able to land on the ground. This marks the end of the mission of this episode 2. I want to thank you everyone for watching. I will see you all next week in the next episode. Please like, subscribe, or comment what you'd like to know more about this mission, and as always, light these candles up.